Good morning, councillors. It gives me great pleasure as your Chair of Lifestyle and Community to welcome you to the 825th round. And today, of course, we have the Lifestyle and Community Committee meeting. Let me acknowledge to our Director, Mr. Elton Twine.
Morning, everyone.
What's this, meeting three?
Meeting three.
Meeting three. This is where we all say, good morning, Mr. Twine. Anyway, councillors, we have a very slim agenda on today. It doesn't mean that there's not a lot of important work happening. I think next round is going to be particularly robust. We've got a new sports and activity plan that will require quite a bit of heavy lifting at committee. But today, let's turn our attention to the work of the committee. We have, as our first item, attendance and apologies. I've received none. Councillors, are you aware of any others? No, so we'll move on from that. Leaves of absence, I've received none. Confirmation of minutes is presently starred. Are there any any conflict of declarations to be made, councillors? No, we can potentially leave that as starred. The forward program, 5.1, presently starred. Councillors, any questions on that item? No, we'll leave that as starred. 6.1, our local area works program additions. That's on page 24. Any questions on that, councillors? No, we'll leave that as starred. Councillor Gates, I understand you have a question on 6.2. Would you like to ask that question now, and then we can make a decision as to whether it's starred or not?
It just related to the process for the sale of this land. I noted under the budget and funding that all costs are to be borne by the applicant, which is fine, but I wondered about the valuation and whether we're just going to accept the applicant's valuation. Are we going to appoint someone to get a valuation on behalf of council, and how that will unfold and why it wasn't done in advance of this report?
Director, please.
Yep. Through the Chair, Councillor Gates, we are going to get our own council valuation. I believe we actually have a pretty good idea of that. Tony, you might want to elaborate a little bit further.
Thank you, Director. Through the Chair, look, we expect it to be quite a small amount. The resolution 2C actually refers to the fact that we will actually go to evaluation, and the reason why we haven't done it as yet is we absolutely needed a council resolution for this to occur, and we didn't want to. We wanted to manage expectations with regards to the applicant, Councillor Gates. Anecdotally, this could be as less as $10,000, a very small amount.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillors, any questions on that or any proposed changes? No? I'm happy to leave that as starred. 6.3, successful transition to new bushfire hazard mitigation service delivery model. Phenomenal work done by city officers. I feel as though we've considered this item quite at length. I'm happy to star that. Councillors, you happy with that? Yep, happy days. Which leaves us with 7.1, radio frequency information device, contract award and other library technology services. Again, councillors, I've met extensively with city officers over a long period of time, very personally comfortable with the approach taken here. If there are any questions, I propose leaving that as starred. Great. Now we just have 7 general business items. So good, so good. No, there's no paper on a Saturday. Oh, no, on a Sunday. So 6, yeah. All right, councillor, would someone like to move the start items? You can move Councillor Caldwell, seconded Councillor Tozer. Councillor Caldwell, did you wish to speak to everything on block? I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? All those against? That is carried. Councillors, any general business items? Councillor Caldwell. Every day we're shuffling. All right. Yeah, please. No, of course.
Yeah, that councillor voiced a right to the state government.
No.
Well, we've got until 1 o'clock, so.
Oh no, I'm just confused because Mr. Twine's sitting at the front. I already raised this with you. Councillor Vorster. I was going to talk about the 2 wheels up, 2 wheels down problem, and I did raise it with Councillor Vorster a few weeks ago, and he reminded me that I should send it to T&I.
Yes.
Because even though it's community services that do the upholding of the law, it's something that Transport and Infrastructure manage. So I'm sorry, I was just filling the gap.
No, look, I think it's worth doing that at our next committee. I only had a gentleman in my office yesterday, quite aggrieved with the fact that he was issued with a warning pin. So it was $0. He
Yeah.
wasn't actually fined. And he made it quite plain to me that he thought it was common sense for residents to be able to address congestion issues by parking
Yeah.
up on the nature strip. I mean, I don't necessarily hold the view, because quite often there are things like stormwater pipes that run inside nature strips, and when people park up on nature strips, particularly non-locals, I've known those things to crack, tree roots get in there, and then homes get flooded. So I'd be very interested in having a fresh look at the issue, and also understanding whether we're able to permit the behaviour in built-up areas altogether because of the interaction with the road rules.
Yeah, I get that. This poor person that contacted me recently had received 5 infringement notices for parking 2 wheels up. So parked 4 wheels down on the roadway and had their side mirror swiped off within a week. So it's a curving road. It's Billinghurst Crescent at Coomera, Upper Coomera, and it's one of those real tricky things. I think it's a state regulation, isn't it?
And I sort of pulled out that guide to safe and livable, safe and legal parking tips to walk through with this gentleman, the online version. And his point was that, look, if I park on the road and my neighbour across the road also parks on the road, then nobody can get through. I explained to him, well, in that case, it's the second vehicle that's actually broken the road rules because you need to leave a clear way. And then I thought to myself, hang on a second, I didn't verbalise this to him because, I'm defending the policy as it stands. But then I thought to myself, how would a parking officer know
Which one?
which was the second vehicle that arrived? Yeah. So once you start pulling at the thread, it can become very fraught. And then I thought to myself, well, maybe there should be a way that people can park up on the nature strip if they're parking on their own nature strip, because the problem is with visitors or non-locals potentially damaging underground infrastructure and trees and all the rest. And then I realised, hang on a second, our parking team have no way of accessing the TMR data that takes registration and pins it.
Yeah.
So, it is a real mess, and maybe a report can at least give us some clarity on what we can and cannot do. So,
Okay. Thanks, Chairman.
Councillor Belden-Lumsden, and then Councillor Castro.
It's loosely related. Just thanks, Chair. I was talking to the director this morning about parking, basically parking permits in the time zones. Similar kind of thing where people are wanting to park on the street or to receive a resident permit, but the issue is the interpretation of the ruling we've got at the moment from that permitting team is that the driveway counts as a dedicated concrete slab for parking. Now, in a practical sense, that doesn't work because it prohibits vehicle movements and that sort of thing. But that was just something I was seeking clarity on from the director. I wasn't sure if that's one that's impacted anyone else in terms of permitting things. It applies specifically to the Health and Knowledge Precinct in Parkwood.
To the driveway within the freehold title. So there's generally one covered and one uncovered car space.
Remember we had a review of that not so long ago, and it related to duplex owners wanting 5 car parking spaces or permits or what have you. And so we reviewed it very thoroughly through the officers, and we came to an agreed policy on it. I can't recall what changed, but it was a problem here within the 2-hour bundle precinct that had been raised, where someone had a double garage and room for 2 cars on the driveway as well, and still wanted on-street parking, and the officers said, no, that's not the intent of the licence for on-street parking because they had sufficient, it was considered, so.
I often encountered that, and we'll come to you, Councillor Castro, I haven't forgotten, into difficult conversations when people seek permits or seek the ability to park on the nature strip, but the garage has been converted into a home office or a gym studio or a self-storage centre. And people, I think, post-original development application, feel as though garages are now versatile spaces rather than places for vehicles to be stored. And it's very difficult,
Well,
very,
they're
very difficult.
uninhabitable rooms, so it's against the regulations for them to do.
Right. So the moment that we have these conversations, they can quite quickly fall afoul of another, say, development compliance investigation. And I think, as Councillor Caldwell often says, be careful inviting council into your life. Right. Councillor Belden-Lumsden, let's go to Councillor Castro and then I'll come back to you. Oh, and Councillor O'Neill. Sorry, my peripheral vision, as the Mayor would say.
Sorry?
You had a question before.
Okay, right. I just wanted to go back to something that Donna said, and I'm just wondering whether, and it's one of those difficult ones, whether that matter actually should be coming here rather than transport and infrastructure, for the simple reason, as you say, that it is, from a regulatory point of view, because what most of this conversation seems to have been around, the local law as such. So I'm wondering if it's more fitting to come here. It crosses over both, obviously.
It does, and look, Councillor Castro, I did get some formal advice on which committee it should go to when Councillor Gates and I originally spoke, and it was very clear it should be T&I. Correct me if I'm wrong, Director, but I think it's because of the interaction with the state road rules.
I was actually going to say that is true too, that it is definitely state. It's not so much us, we're governed by that. But okay, so that's the reason. All right.
And when you think about it, the actual, say, the parking permit system doesn't come through here. It comes through T&I, and it's merely the enforcement that lands with us.
Parking permit, yes, but I was talking about the 2 wheels up, 2 wheels, not the parking permit.
Yeah, I think the issue at play is council's enforcement of those rules.
Yes.
Right. The rules are set with T&I, but it's the issuing of the tickets that sit with us.
Yeah. Okay.
Councillor O'Neill, then Councillor Belden-Lumsden.
Thanks, Chair. When we had the blitz just recently on verge parking, I have been told that there is an officer in T&I, I guess, that is looking at safe verge parking and signage to go with that. And I've put forward a particular area in my division that they're looking at, I think favourably.
That's good, and I think, Councillor Tozer, you had a good experience recently with some signage overriding rules that would otherwise apply in non-built-up areas. Is that right?
Correct. So we have a park that is commonly used as an off-leash dog area and an equine activity area, which is this very strange combination at the best of times. But unfortunately, parking enforcement officers patrolled in that area and started issuing tickets for cars with horse trailers, quite appropriately parked on the verge, and then we worked closely with Transport and Infrastructure to get a verge permit, even though that was the informal and incumbent arrangement that had been in place for many, many years. The actions of the parking enforcement officer compelled us to formalise that with signage. So we're now exploring that option in a number of places where there isn't an impact on residents, but we've actually effectively delivered a park where people need to be able to park, so there isn't, when there isn't enough room or there isn't appropriate width of the road to accommodate on-road parking.
And just to be clear, that was in a non-built-up area.
Yeah, correct. So there was at least 100 metres between two homes.
Yes.
And it was a rural residential zone, so streetlights weren't within 100 metres either. So there was all of the metrics inside the state regulation that define what a non-built-up area were met.
Yep.
And we were able to deliver that verge parking permit solution.
So, Councillors, my understanding is that in built-up areas, we have no discretion, but in non-built-up areas, we've got the ability through signage to override particular rules.
So to be fair as well, I had probably put some pressure isn't the right word, but I had asked some fairly pointed questions about whether the rural residential acreage areas was really a high priority for parking officers, even when a complaint was made. We have sparse resources in that area, and was that exactly the right place where we needed to be allocating our resources? And since that season of difficulty, we've seen a significant reduction in the number of patrols in rural residential areas, and frankly, I think that's because there are lots of other high volume, high issue parking areas where those pressures are much greater for the public, and the community interest is much greater than what it's like in an acreage area.
And I appreciate having more of those resources available to Div 11. Councillor Gates?
Thanks, Chairman. I just wanted to say that it's good to get clarification around that signage being available only in rural or rural residential areas, because it did result in an influx to my office of people who live in narrow developments, and one in particular, Coomera Shores, which was one of the first villages developed at Coomera, and it has pretty narrow streets, and of course they've now said it's adjacent to a boat ramp, so people have boats and properties that can't properly house the boats on some occasions, and so they asked could they have signage installed which permitted them to park 2 wheels up, 2 wheels down. So it's good to have clarified that it is certainly not being considered in those types of areas. And I think also I just wanted to add that my experience about needing patrols in rural residential areas mainly relates to the parking of heavy or long vehicles, because that is rife in many of the areas where there are large blocks. So, we still have a need for that to be patrolled for the amenity of most residents, but I get what Councillor Toes is saying about his issue.
We haven't, to be frank, we don't have a massive issue with heavy vehicles or long vehicles in our acreage areas, and I couldn't recall a time where I've had a significant complaint about that, and so I'm pretty happy with, at the moment, whilst Councillor Gates might have unique issues in her division, in my division, there are really targeted places where we'd like parking enforcement to be done, and that's really around the Firth Park area on special event days, and then the Mudgeeraba Village precinct where the suburban environment is, normal suburban environment. To me, they're the areas where we should be focusing our resources when it comes to parking enforcement.
Well, Councillor Owen-Jones?
So could I just ask a question through you to the Director in regards to the city officers and how they go about programming, in particular weekend patrols, which is, and I was heartened to hear from the Chair that there were nil penalty infringement notices issued. Is it methodical in the context that, so I recently had an area in Oxenford near Maudsley, on Common Code Drive, where they went through on a Sunday with the car. And to me, it would be interesting to know how often the car had visited and whether or not there should be a program that in part is about issuing nil penalty infringement notices, where it's been a ad hoc drive through an area that they haven't been through for years, if that makes sense.
Through the Chair, that's a good question, and it's a question I have put to the officers responsible for management of or enforcement of parking to seek to understand what methodology is applied to this, particularly with respect to the occurrences around ad hoc weekend parking. My discussions a couple of weeks ago were that should we come across the examples that have played out in previous months, we issue warnings first and we engage in an education process. That's been well received by the officers, who understand that it's better to take the community on the journey. People may not realise that they are actually running foul of our local laws by their behaviours. So the early feedback that we've got from the last couple of weeks is that's been well received. And I'm aware of feedback coming through several councillors' offices, and I think you mentioned it also, Chair, this morning, that you've had someone who's received a warning rather than an infringement notice straight up. So that's a better process. I'm still not entirely comfortable, I guess, with the methodology as it applies to deployment of licence plate recognition vehicles. Certainly my intention is that they be applied, as has been agreed with Transport and Infrastructure, to the more urban areas where it's much more clearer, where that technology can be appropriately applied without necessarily the grey areas that we've experienced around some of these wide suburban verges. So that has been the practice in the past 6 weeks, and it seems to be working a lot more effectively, but there's a report still coming back to me internally around the deployment of those assets.
Councillor Owen-Jones, Councillor Gates and Councillor Tozer.
And through you to the Director. And my understanding is when a nil penalty enforcement notice is issued to a number plate on a car, that there can't be a second nil penalty infringement notice issued to the same vehicle for the offence that it was warned. I'd be interested in having that confirmed.
That's my understanding too.
Councillor Gates.
Thank you. Just one last question. With the park-safe vehicles, do the officers take them home and then travel to and from work, or do they have to come into the depot or council to collect that vehicle?
It's the latter, Councillor Gates.
Thank you.
Councillor Tozer.
I wasn't aware when Mr. Twine talked a little bit about the change in approach, and I'm really grateful about that. I think, you know, in our office we found the actual administrative burden with managing community expectations when there was a little bit of grey area around the law and or the state regulation, because I think there is a little bit of subjective interpretation about how long is 100 metres, what does it look like, you know. It's been really very positive, particularly in the last 6 weeks, and our administrative burden has dropped significantly in that realm as a result of that change in approach, and that's saved the ratepayer money and time. We've been able to focus our resources on other things, and I'm assuming probably the customer call centre has probably experienced that same thing. Whilst you may not have seen that in the transport department or in the parking enforcement department, we've definitely seen that in the amount of queries we're calling about that. And yeah.
I lied. I've got
No,
one more
you
question.
don't lie in this chamber, Councillor Gates.
I
Come
did.
on.
I did. I was simply going to ask if someone who is on Transport and Infrastructure might like to raise a general business item today, because I'm not on that committee. But I think it's something that we would value, seeking further advice from the state about the possibility of relaxing that 2 wheels up, 2 wheels down law.
I'll have a chat to the chair about it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I think a good play. I mean, instinctive. Yeah, absolutely. This debate's the one to be had at TNI. I mean, instinctively, I think there'd be more warts on the issue, pursuing change with the state without understanding what the current problems are. So I would imagine a 2-step process where we get a report back which sets out options, and then we can resolve to go to the state. I think a good place to start though is, and I'm not sure if this is for us or for TNI, is we do have that safe and legal parking tips booklet. It'd be really good if that booklet indicated with a label whether this was a council rule or a road rule on like per offence, so that we could show the community who might be complaining about an issue, well, here's the guide and you will see that it's actually a road rule issue and not a council rule. It's just a little graphic design thing that could clear that up, that jurisdictional issue.
Chair, that's an initiative that we started in TI, so it would be a TI responsibility to make those amendments, and it is really timely to do another version of that booklet. So I think that is appropriate. The other thing you might be aware of if you've been watching the news recently is that quite a few other jurisdictions are experiencing the same issue. There was quite a big report on one of the news channels last week, I think it was Ipswich, the same sort of issue.
Yeah, we'll leave it before we become LNC TNI. Yeah, one council, one city.
But if you want to puff out your meeting, all you need is a general business discussion about how councillors can better represent in regards to penalty infringement notices.
By door knocking.
Yeah.
Wearing out our shoe leather. The director and I had a chat about the way Park Safe works, which is what it's kind of talking to. in this conversation, and the new approach. And related to the director, that quite often if I have pockets of the community that are concerned about, irregular parking behaviour, let's call it that, I'll often survey an area, a catchment, with a copy of the Safe and Legal Parking Guide. And I ask people, look, before I raise a CR to request regular patrols in your area, please read this booklet and take note that you may be fined for parking up on the nature strip, parking in your own driveway if you overhang past your letterbox, so on and so forth. And without fail, funnily enough, without fail, the community always votes for that enforcement to be carried out. They always vote for it to be carried out. And when there are people who have been fined because they've parked up on the verge, I'm in a strong position to be able to say, look, this is the way you and your neighbourhood, or not you, but your neighbourhood wishes to manage parking. And you've done it with all of the information at hand. And so, like Councillor Tozer foreshadowed, the administrative burden drops because people understand it's like community-led service standards. But it's always only at an estate level. So we get the same administrative benefit, but with a different lived outcome.
So in my community, very similarly, I'll survey groups of residents in the acreage areas, and inevitably they say, no, we'd prefer there wasn't enforcement in these areas. This is not an impost. And I can appreciate that in places like Benogan Valley, where people are living on 4,000 square metre blocks with large frontages and 8 to 12 metre frontages, they're going to have a totally different approach than Varsity Lakes on Varsity Parade or North Lakes Drive or whatever, where the congestion is unbelievable and actually really quite unsafe. Whereas it is in my area, it is there. Like, look, I would prefer there wasn't enforcement. So it's quite.
No, too much. I'm closing the meeting at 9:36. Meeting closed.